Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. You are not getting in these videos simply an audiobook of this book. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, you're also getting lots of commentary from me. Some of it, a number of you have pointed out, must be an echo. Some of you have sent me emails and said the kind of commentary that you're doing now must be an echo of what you were like as a teacher. And that I realize belatedly that that is true, because some of the commentary that I'm giving is meant to up the interest in the text in ways that can only be done if I am right along with someone who's reading this for the first time. I am not reading this for the first time, but I switch between those two registers of someone who is showing you things and someone who is going through it with you. And I guess it must just be an old habit, like falling off a bicycle, because I shifted right back into it. But we are continuing with the story of a clerical war in the close of Barchester Cathedral, where the old bishop has died and a new bishop has come in to take his place, Mr. Prouty and his imperious wife, and their chaplain, the bishop's personal chaplain, Mr. Slope, who has no actual preferment in the diocese, but is nevertheless a person who cannot be denied because he's directly connected to the authority of the bishop. And he has all sorts of ideas about changes that he wants to make at Barchester. But one of those changes seems to be outside of his reach. One of those changes was mandated by an act of parliament. And it touches on the events in The Warden, which I read out loud to you in conjunction with Micah Cummins and Mark from Book Time with Elvis, both of whom I have driven off BookTube. In that story, there is an old charitable hospital that's been running for a long, long time, centuries, in Barchester. And it is run by a warden, Mr. Harding. And he takes care of the 12 gentle old souls, 12 old men who have reached the end of their life and don't, it's a charitable hospital. They don't have anywhere else to go. And a man named John Bold comes to Barchester and raises a ruckus. He thinks, why on earth should this warden be drawing a gentleman's wages, almost £1,000 a year, for nominal or no work at all? Surely that money should be divided amongst these poor old men, even though they would have no use for it whatsoever. Even though it's only greed. They don't have any. They have beautiful lodgings, all their needs taken care of. John Bold makes trouble enough so that it gets into the newspapers. It bedevils Mr. Harding, even while John Bold is falling in love with Mr. Harding's daughter, Eleanor. And Mr. Harding resigns the hospital because he doesn't view himself, he doesn't have the temperament for being in the public eye, for being in the columns of the Jupiter, the newspaper. And the hospital, we're told, sort of falls into desuetude. It's half the beadsmen die, no other warden is announced, until this act of parliament, which sets up a wardenship at greatly reduced annual fee, half the annual fee, and institutes that there will be a warden. And everyone in Barchester just assumes that new bishop or no new bishop, Mr. Harding will go back in that job. Everyone in Barchester for years has referred to him as the warden. It's been weird, these months where he has not been warden. And Mr. Harding comes to assume that it will be his as well, that he will also go back to that position. But when he interviews with Mr. Slope tells him that all the old usages of the Church of England are going to be carted away with the rubbish. And there will be a new warden in the hospital. It's perfectly fine with Mr. Slope if it's Mr. Harding, but the job will be different. Not only will the wages be cut in half, but it will be a Sunday school with sermons and preaching. And that will be Mr. Harding's job. And Mr. Harding says, well, in the chapter that we read, he says, well, I don't think that's fit for me. I'll have to consult with my friends. And they leave the matter undecided. But Mr. Slope is content to start telling people that Mr. Harding has refused. He has not. We just know that he's going to. We know that he's pretty much decided to do that until he visits his son-in-law, the Archdeacon, Dr. Grantley, who pumps fire into him and says, no, you must, this man is all bluster. Neither he nor the bishop has the ability to make these changes or to deny your appointment to that position. You have to resolve yourself to fight. And Mr. Harding's resolve to fight is considerably weakened by the fact that the prospect has been raised by the Archdeacon's wife that Mr. Slope may want to court Eleanor, who is a widow now that John Bold is dead. He's left her not only a widow, but a comparatively wealthy widow, £1,200 a year. And that is what this next chapter is about. Chapter 15 is called The Widow's Suitors, which will take us through the two people who currently have designs on that £1,200 a year, and end with a remarkable passage from Trollope that I'm going to want to talk to you about. So let's read chapter 15. Mr. Slope lost no time in availing himself of the bishop's permission to see Mr. Quiverful, and it was his interview with this worthy pastor that he first learned that Mrs. Bold was worth the wooing. Mr. Quiverful is Mr. Slope's candidate to take over the wardenship of the hospital. Because he's a desperate man, he has 14 or 15 living daughters, so he's desperately poor. He could very much use the money, and as a result, he will be under Mr. Slope's thumb. He rode out to Puddingdale to communicate to the embryo warden the goodwill of the bishop in his favor, and during the discussion on the matter, it was not unnatural that the pecuniary resources of Mr. Harding and his family should become the subject of remark. Mr. Quiverful, with his 14 children and his 400 a year, was a very poor man, and the prospect of this new preferment, which was to be held together with his living, was very much grateful to him. To what clergyman so circumstanced would not such a prospect be very grateful? But Mr. Quiverful had long been acquainted with Mr. Harding, and had received kindnesses at his hands, so that his heart misgave him as he thought of supplanting a friend at the hospital. Nevertheless, he was extremely civil, cringingly civil, to Mr. Slope, treated him quite as the great man, entreated this great man to do him the honor to drink a glass of sherry, at which, as it was very poor masala, the now pampered Slope turned up his nose, and ended by declaring his extreme obligation to the bishop and Mr. Slope, and his great desire to accept the hospital if it were certainly the case that Mr. Harding had refused it. What man, as needy as Mr. Quiverful, could have been more disinterested? Mr. Harding did positively refuse it, said Mr. Slope, with a certain air of offended dignity, when he heard of the conditions on which the appointment is now subjected. Of course, you understand, Mr. Quiverful, that the same conditions will be imposed on yourself. This is a flat lie. Mr. Slope is simply lying. Mr. Harding did not flatly refuse. Mr. Quiverful cared nothing for conditions. He would have undertaken to preach any number of sermons Mr. Slope might have chosen to dictate, or to pass on every remaining hour of his Sundays within the walls of the Sunday school. What sacrifice, or at any rate what promises, would have been too much to make for such an addition to his income, and for such a house? But his mind still recurred to Mr. Harding. To be sure, said he, Mr. Harding's daughter is very rich, and why should he trouble himself about the hospital? He's trying to talk himself into it. You mean Mrs. Grantley, said Mr. Slope, meaning Mr. Harding's other daughter, the archdeacon's wife. I mean his widowed daughter, said the other. Mrs. Bold has 1,200 a year of her own, and I suppose Mr. Harding means to live with her. 1,200 a year of her own, said Slope, and very shortly afterwards took his leave, avoiding, as far as it was possible for him to do so, any further allusion to the hospital. 1,200 a year, said he to himself as he rode slowly away. If it were the fact that Mrs. Bold had 1,200 a year of her own, what a fool would he be to oppose her father's return to his old place? The train of Mr. Slope's idea will probably be plain to all my readers. Why should he not make the 1,200 a year his own? And if he did so, would it not be well for him to have a father-in-law comfortably provided with the good things of this world? Would it not, moreover, be much more easy for him to gain the daughter if he did all in his power to forward the father's views? These questions presented themselves to him in a very forcible way, and yet there were many points of doubt. If he resolved to restore Mr. Harding his former place, he must take the necessary steps doing so at once. He must immediately talk over the bishop, quarrel on the matter with Mrs. Proudie, whom he knew he could not talk over, and let Mr. Quiverful know that he had been a little too precipitate to Mr. Harding's positive refusal. That he could effect all this he did not doubt, but he did not wish to effect it for nothing. He did not wish to give way to Mr. Harding and then be rejected by the daughter. He did not wish to lose one influential friend before he had gained another. All that talk of ecclesiastical reform goes out the window at the prospect of money. We are just not supposed to like this guy, although Trollope is going to put in a word for him. Thus he rode home, meditating many things in his mind. It occurred to him that Mrs. Bold was sister-in-law to the archdeacon, and that not even for 1,200 a year would he submit to that imperious man. A rich wife was a great desideratum to him, but success in his profession was still greater, and there were, moreover, other rich women who might be willing to become wives, and after all, this 1,200 a year might, when inquired into, melt away into some small sum utterly beneath his notice. Then also he remembered that Mrs. Bold had a son. She does. She has a little baby. We haven't had enough of the little baby already with Trollope's revolting baby talk. We're going to get it really soon, so batten down the hatches, but not in this chapter. Another circumstance also much influenced him, though it was one which may almost be said to have influenced him against his will. The vision of the Signora Neroni was perpetually before his eyes. It would be too much to say that Mr. Slope was lost in love, and yet he thought, and kept continually thinking, that he had never seen so beautiful a woman. He was a man whose nature was open to impulses, and the wiles of the Italianized charmer had been thoroughly successful in imposing upon his thoughts. We will not talk about his heart. Not that he had no heart, but because his heart had little to do with his present feelings. His taste had been pleased, his eyes charmed, and his vanity gratified. He had been dazzled by the sort of loveliness which he had never before seen, and had caught his eye by an easy, free, voluptuous manner which was perfectly new to him. He had never been so tempted before, and the temptation was now irresistible. He had it not owned to himself that he cared for this woman more than for others around him, but yet he thought often of the time when he might see her next, and made, almost unconsciously, little cunning plans for seeing her frequently. He had called at Dr. Stanhope's house the day after the bishop's party, and then the warmth of his admiration had been fed with fresh fuel. If the Signora had been kind in her manner and flattering in her speech when lying upon a bishop's sofa with the eyes of so many upon her, she had been much more so in her mother's drawing-room, with no one present but her sister to repress either her nature or her art. Mr. Slope had thus left her quite bewildered, and could not willingly admit into his brain any scheme, a part of which would be the necessity of his abandoning all further special friendship with this lady. And so slowly he rode on, meditative. And here must the author beg it to be remembered that Mr. Slope was not in all things a bad man. His motives, like those of most men, were mixed, and though his conduct was generally very different from that which we would wish to praise, it was actuated perhaps as often as that of the majority of the world by a desire to do his duty. He believed in the religion which he taught, harsh, unpalatable, and uncharitable as that religion was. He believed those whom he wished to get under his hoof, the Grantleys and the Gwynns of the church, to be the enemies of that religion. He believed himself to be a pillar of strength, destined to do great things, and with that subtle, selfish, ambiguous sophistry to which the minds of men are all subject, he had taught himself to think that in doing much for the promotion of his own interests, he was doing much also for the promotion of religion. How many planes does Kenneth Copeland own? But Mr. Slope had never been an immoral man. Indeed, he had resisted temptation to immorality with a strength of purpose which was creditable to him. He had early in life devoted himself to works which were not compatible with the ordinary pleasures of youth, and he had abandoned such pleasures not without a struggle. I don't want to think about the young Mr. Slope. It must therefore be conceived that he did not admit to himself that he warmly admired the beauty of a married woman without heartfelt stings of conscience. And to pacify that conscience, he had to teach himself that the nature of his admiration was innocent. And thus he rode along, meditative and ill at ease. His conscience had not a word to say against his choosing the widow and her fortune. That he looked upon a godly work rather than otherwise as a deed which, if carried through, would redound to his credit as a Christian. On that side lay no future remorse, no conduct which he might probably have to forget, no inward stings. If it should turn out to be really the fact that Mrs. Bold had 1,200 a year at her own disposal, Mr. Slope would rather look upon it as a duty which he owed his religion to make himself the master of the wife and the money, as a duty, too, in which some amount of self-sacrifice would be necessary. He would have to give up his friendship with the Signora, his resistance to Mr. Harding, his antipathy. No, no, he found on mature self-examination that he could not bring himself to give up his antipathy to Dr. Grantley. He would marry the lady as the enemy of her brother-in-law, if such an arrangement suited her. If not, she must look elsewhere for a husband. So even Mr. Slope has a line he will draw. He is deadly enemy of Dr. Grantley. It was with such resolve in his heart that he reached Barchester. He would at once ascertain the truth, what the truth might be as to the lady's wealth, and having done this, he would be ruled by circumstances as his conduct respecting the hospital. If he found that he could turn round and secure the place for Mr. Harding without much self-sacrifice, he would do so. But if not, he would woo the daughter in opposition to the father. But in no case would he succumb to the archdeacon. He saw his horse taken round to the stables, and immediately went forth to commence his inquiries. To give Mr. Slope his due, he was not a man who ever let much grass grow under his feet. Poor Eleanor! She was doomed to be the intended victim of more schemes than one. About this time that Mr. Slope was visiting the vicar of Puddingdale, a discussion took place respecting her charms and the wealth at Dr. Stanhope's house in the Close. There had been morning callers there, and people had been told some truth and also some falsehood respecting the property which John Bold had left behind him. By degrees, the visitors went, and as the doctor went with them, and as the doctor's wife had not yet made her appearance, Charlotte Stanhope and her brother were left together. He was sitting idly at the table, scrawling caricatures of Barchester notables, then yawning, then turning over a book or two, and evidently at a loss to how to kill his time without much labor. "You haven't done much, Bertie, about getting any orders," said his sister. Remember, that's why he came. He could have been left behind in Italy. That was his father's idea, was to leave him behind in Italy. He came to Barchester to get orders for sculptures, because now he fancies himself a sculptor. "Orders," said he. "Who on earth is there at Barchester to give one orders? Who among the people here could possibly think it worth his while to have his head done into marble?" "Then you mean to give up your profession?" said she. "No, I don't," said he, going on with some absurd portrait of the bishop. "Look at that, Lottie. Isn't that the little man all over, apron and all? I'd go on with my profession at once, as you call it, if the governor would set me up in his studio in London. But as to sculpture at Barchester, I suppose half the people here don't know what a torso means." "The governor will not give you a shilling to start you in London," said Lottie. "Indeed, he can't give you what would be sufficient, for he has not got it. But you might start yourself very well, if you pleased." "How the deuce am I to do it?" said he. "To tell you the truth, Bertie, you'll never make a penny by any profession." "That's what I often think myself," said he, not in the least offended. "Some men have a great gift of making money, but they can't spend it. Others can't put 2 shillings together, but they have a great talent for all sorts of outlay. I begin to think of my genius as wholly in the latter line." "How do you mean to live, then?" asked the sister. "I suppose I must regard myself as a young raven and look for heavenly manna. Besides, we've all got something. We'll all have something when the governor goes. When the father dies, they'll get something." "Yes, you'll have enough to supply yourself in gloves and boots. That is, if the Jews have not got the possession of it, meaning moneylenders, meaning whether or not Dr. Vesey Stanhope has already mortgaged his income. I believe they have the most of it already. I wonder, Bertie, at your indifference, that you, with your talent and personal advantages, should never try to settle yourself in life. I look forward with dread to the time when the governor must go. Mother and Madeline and I, we shall be poor enough, but you will have absolutely nothing." "Sufficient for the day is the evil thereof," said Bertie. "Will you take my advice?" said his sister. "You can depend on it," said the brother. "Will you marry a wife with money?" "At any rate," said he, "I won't marry one without. Wives with money ain't so easy to get to nowadays. The parsons pick them all up. And a parson will pick up the wife I mean for you if you do not look quickly about it. The wife I mean is Mrs. Bold." "Whew," whistled Bertie. "A widow." "She is very beautiful," said Charlotte. "With a son and heir all ready to my hand," said Bertie. "A baby that will very likely die," said Charlotte. "I don't see that," said Bertie. "But however he may live for me, I don't wish to kill him. Only it must be owned that a ready-made family is a drawback." "There is only one, after all," pleaded Charlotte. "And that a very little one," said the maid, as the maid-servant said, rejoined Bertie. A reference to something you don't need to think about. It's just banter between them. She's mentioning to Bertie that there's only one child. "Beggars mustn't be choosers, Bertie. You can't have everything." "God knows I'm not unreasonable," said he, "nor yet opinionated. And if you'll arrange it for me, Lottie, I'll marry the lady. Only mark this, the money must be sure, and the income at my disposal, at any rate for the lady's life." Charlotte was explaining to her brother that he must make love for himself if he meant to carry on the matter, and was encouraging him to do so by warm eulogiums on Eleanor's beauty when the signora was brought into the dining room. When at home, and subject to the gaze of none but her own family, she allowed herself to be dragged about by 2 persons, and her 2 bearers were now deposited her on her sofa. She was not quite so grand in her apparel as she had been at the bishop's party, but yet she was dressed with much care, and though there was a look of care and pain about her eyes, she was, even by daylight, extremely beautiful. A hint that we haven't had so far, that Madeline Vesey Neroni might be in pain, that the brutality that left her crippled might also give her pain. "Well, Madeline, so I'm going to be married," said Bertie began, as soon as the servants had withdrawn. "There's no other foolish thing left you haven't done," said Madeline, "and therefore you're quite right to try that." "She's not had an easy time of marriage." "Oh, you think it's a foolish thing, do you?" said he. "There's Lottie advising me to marry by all means. But on such a subject your opinion ought to be the best. You have experience to guide you." "Yes, I have," said Madeline, with a sort of harsh sadness in her tone, which seemed to say, "What is it to you if I'm sad? I've never asked for your sympathy." Bertie was sorry when he saw that she was hurt by what he said, and he came and squatted on the floor close by her face to make peace with her. Come, Mad, I was only joking, you know that. But in sober earnest, Lottie is advising me to marry. She wants me to marry this Mrs. Bold. She's a widow with lots of tin, a fine baby, a beautiful complexion, and the George and the Dragon Hotel up the street. By Jove, Lottie, if I marry her, I'll keep the public house myself. It's just the life to suit me. What? Said Madeline, that vapid, swarthy creature in the widow's cap, who looked as though her clothes had been stuck on her back with a pitchfork? The Signora never allowed any woman to be beautiful. Instead of being vapid, said Lottie, I call her a very lovely woman. She was by far the loveliest woman in the rooms the other night. That is, excepting you, Madeline. Even the compliment did not soften the asperity of the maimed beauty. Every woman is charming according to Lottie, said she. I never knew an eye with so little true appreciation. In the first place, what woman on earth could look well in such a thing as she had on her head? But of course she wears a widow's cap. She'll put it off when Bertie marries her. I don't see any of course about it, said Madeline. The death of 20 husbands would not make me undergo such a penance. It's as much a relic of paganism as the sacrifice of a Hindu woman at the burning of her husband's body. If not so bloody, it is quite as barbarous and quite as useless. She's stuck on the widow's cap. We're going to get more of that because she's stuck on that as a fashion faux pas. But you don't blame her for that, said Bertie. She does it because it's the custom of the country. People would think it ill if she didn't do it. Exactly, said Madeline. She's just one of those English non-entities who would tie up her head in a bag for 3 months every summer if her mother and grandfather had tied up their heads before her. It would never occur to her to think whether there was any use in submitting to such a nuisance. It's very hard in a country like England for a young woman to set herself in opposition to prejudices of that sort, said the prudent Charlotte. What you mean is that it's very hard for a fool not to be a fool, said Madeline. Bertie Stanhope had been so much knocked about the world from his earliest years that he had not retained much respect for the gravity of English customs, but even to his mind an idea presented itself that perhaps in a wife, true British prejudice would not in the long run be less agreeable than Anglo-Italian freedom from restraint. He did not exactly say so, but he expressed the idea in another way. I fancy, said he, that if I were to die and then walk, meaning come back from the dead, I should think that my widow looked better in one of those caps than in any other kind of headdress. Yes, and you'd fancy also that she could do nothing better than shut herself up and cry for you, or else burn herself. But you would think differently. But she would think differently. She'd probably wear one of those horrid she-helmets because she'd want the courage not to do so. But she'd wear it with a heart longing for the time when she might be allowed to throw it off. I hate such shallow, false pretenses. For my part, I would let the world say what it pleased, and show no grief if I felt none, and perhaps not if I did. But wearing a widow's cap won't lessen her fortune, said Charlotte. Or increase it, said Madeline, so why on earth does she do it? But Lottie's object is to make her put it off, said Bertie. And widow's cap. I think they're talking about something else here, just using that as a symbol. If it be true that she has got 1200 a year quite at her own disposal, and she be not utterly vulgar in her manners, I would advise you to marry her. I dare say she is to be had for the asking. As you are not going to marry her for love, it doesn't much matter whether she is good-looking or not. As to you really marrying a woman for love, I don't believe you are fool enough for that. Oh, Madeline, exclaimed her sister. Oh, Charlotte, said the other. And you don't mean to say that no man can love a woman unless he be a fool? I mean very much the same thing, that any man who's willing to sacrifice his interest to get possession of a pretty face is a fool. Pretty faces are to be had cheaper than that. I hate your mawkish sentimentality, Lottie. You know as well as I do the way husbands and wives generally live together. You know how far from the warmth of conjugal affection can withstand the trial of a bad dinner, or a rainy day, or of the least privation which poverty brings with it. You know what freedom man claims for himself, what slavery he would exact from his wife if he could. And you know also how wives generally obey. Marriage means tyranny on one side and deceit on the other. I say that a man is a fool to sacrifice his interest for such a bargain. A woman, too generally, has no other way of living. What this reflects on what Vesey Neroni went through in her own marriage, you hardly want to think about. You hardly want to think about it. But Bertie has no other way of living, said Charlotte. Then, in God's name, let him marry Mrs. Bold, said Madeline, and so it was settled between them. But let the gentle-hearted reader be under no apprehension whatsoever. This is Trollope's narrator, or even Trollope himself, entering the story, just directly addressing the story. It is not destined that Eleanor shall marry Mr. Slope or Bertie Stanhope. And here perhaps it may be allowed to the novelist to explain his views on a very important point in the art of telling tales. He ventures to reprobate that system which goes so far as to violate all proper confidence between the author and his readers by maintaining nearly to the end of the third volume, because these things were, when they were serialized, and then when they were printed in novels, it was a Victorian triple-decker. You got the book was in 3 separate volumes. An original 3-volume set of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope would probably set you back a bit of tin. They weren't just in one book. Cheap printing did not exist yet. But anyway, where are we here? Oh yes, the novelist is intervening. He's talking about his craft. He ventures to reprobate that system which goes so far as to violate all proper confidence between the author and his readers by maintaining nearly to the end of the third volume a mystery as to the fate of their favorite personage. Nay, more and worse than this is too frequently done. Have not often the profoundest efforts of genius been used to baffle the aspirations of the reader, to raise false hopes and false fears, and to give rise to expectations which are never to be realized? Are not promises to be made of delightful horrors, in lieu of which the writer produces nothing but the most commonplace realities in his final chapter? And is there not a species of deceit in which this honesty of the present age should lend no countenance? Trollope is saying this, of all people. Anyway, let's continue. He's not done. And what can be the worth of that solicitude which a peep into the third volume can utterly dissipate? What the value of those literary charms which are absolutely destroyed by their employment, when we have once learned what was that picture before which was hung Mrs. Ratcliffe's solemn curtain, we feel no further interest about either the frame or the veil. It's a reference to a popular novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho. We feel no further interest about either the frame or the veil. They are to us merely a receptacle for old bones, an inappropriate coffin, which we would wish to have decently buried out of our sight. And then, how grievous a thing it is to have the pleasure of your novel destroyed by the ill-considered triumph of a previous reader. Oh, you needn't be alarmed for Augusta. Of course she accepts Gustavus in the end. How ill-natured you are, Susan, says Kitty with a tear in her eyes. I don't care a bit about it now, meaning Trollope is saying, what about the readers who spoil the end of the book? Kitty has had the novel spoiled. Someone has told her the ending to the storyline. How very ill-natured you are, Susan, says Kitty with tears in her eyes. I don't care a bit about it now. Dear Kitty, this is Trollope addressing Kitty, this imaginary reader of his. Dear Kitty, if you will read my book, you may defy the ill nature of your sister. There shall be no secret that she can tell you. Nay, take the last chapter, if you please. Learn from its pages all the results of our troubled story, and the story shall have lost none of its interest, if indeed there be any interest to lose. Our doctrine is that the author and the reader should move along together in full confidence with each other. Let the personages of the drama undergo ever so complete a comedy of errors among themselves, but let the spectator never mistake the Syracusan for the Ephesian. Otherwise he is one of the dupes, and the part of the dupe is never dignified. I would not for the value of this chapter have it believed by a single reader that my Eleanor could bring herself to marry Mr. Slope, or that she should be sacrificed to a Bertie Stanhope. But among the good folk of Barchester, many believe both the one and the other. Well, that's how Chapter 15 ends. Chapter 15 is 2 groups of people speculating about having designs on Eleanor Bold's money. Neither Mr. Slope nor Bertie Stanhope even for a moment considers her as a person. They're only thinking about her money. But once those 2 parts of the chapter are done, we then get this page-long discourse from the author himself, saying the most unbelievable hypocrisy, saying, well, it's really, as far as I'm concerned, the author and the reader should be traveling together in complete confidence. If I'm telling you a worthwhile story, then you could go all the way to the end of the 3rd volume, in other words, the conclusion of the novel, read how it all comes out, and still be interested in the story. Now, on one hand, Trollope is absolutely right about that. Because he is a really, really good storyteller. He is not a cheap dime store hack, where once you do know the ending, there is no more reason in reading the book. Some really, really popular books, written with a lot less care and attention than he has, a lot less humanity than he has, are victim to that. I mean, is there anybody who reads, for instance, Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie? Is there anybody who reads that book 2nd time even remotely like they read it the 1st time? I don't believe there is. Agatha Christie is simply not that good a writer. I would say that 90% of the momentum, of the affection, of the joy, of the headlong movement of reading Murder on the Orient Express is getting to find out what the ending is. You know that by the time you get 150 pages into that book, you know that the ending is going to be a humdinger, and it is. But once you know it, reading the book a second time, unless you've forgotten it, reading the book a second time will have drastically less pleasure. Whereas it's been my experience that rereading Trollope gets better. His books get better the more you reread them, even once you know every last detail of what's going to happen. So on the one hand, he's right about that. He's right about himself anyway, that you could read how all of this turns out and still love the book. Absolutely. But on the other hand, he's a monstrous hypocrite to act like this is his dictum as an author. That absolutely isn't true, and it couldn't be. If he actually lived up to this dictum, his editor, when this was being serialized and he was getting good money for the serialization, would have canceled the serialization the minute he gave his hand away. He's going on and on here in a very pompous manner about how, oh, my Eleanor, I'm not going to leave you in doubt. She's not going to end up with either of these ghastly men. Is he being so forthright about the fate of the hospital? About the victor in the war between Mr. Slope and Dr. Grantley? No, he's not. And what is the reason for that? It's because he knows he'll be giving away his story. That's an essential element of storytelling. It's ridiculous for him to complain about it, especially when he does it everywhere. How many twists are there at the end of the Eustace Diamonds? What about Mr. Scarborough's family? Or is he Popenjoy? These books literally hinge on last-minute reveals. A large part of the plot does. It is certainly a thing that Trollope practices as a novelist. I don't know how he could say otherwise. He is right in his larger point, even with stories like Is He Popenjoy or Mr. Scarborough's Family, or the Eustace Diamonds, where there are MacGuffins that run throughout the book and will catch you by surprise the first time you're reading it. He's right that even in books like that, the joy of rereading it, even knowing what's coming, is, if anything, it's the same or enhanced. When you know the trick that's coming, you can all of a sudden appreciate it more. Sometimes Trollope has actually lived up to this dictum. The most prominent example I can think of is Orley Farm, where there is a question in Orley Farm. We will get to Orley Farm, but there's a question in Orley Farm. There's a question about whether or not one character has done thing X or not done thing X. And you are expecting, when you're reading the book the first time, you are expecting, okay, well, we're going to get all sorts of clues and all sorts of factors here, there, and in one direction and the other. And then at the end, we will, and then boom, in the middle of the book, literally in the middle of the book, the character admits the truth of what they did. And the first time you're reading Orley Farm, you're thinking, okay, well, this novel has to collapse now. And it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. So on one level, Trollope is right, in that he doesn't have to play these parlor games. But on another level, he's dead wrong and also the mother of all hypocrites, because he plays them. He's playing them in this book. But it was very interesting. It's always very interesting. He does this from time to time. There's a famous passage where he talks about putting the cart before the horse as a novelist. That's quoted often. It's often pulled out in excerpt. But he does this from time to time in other books. And I believe, like we've mentioned about Barchester Towers, this is the first book of his that took off like a bottle rocket, that really made his name, where all of a sudden people were saying, oh yeah, they weren't saying, oh yeah, there's this author and I read a book of his, set in Ireland or whatever, and I thought there were parts of it that were quite good. Instead, after this, people are saying, I want the next Trollope. I don't care what it is, I want the next thing from this author. I myself believe, and I think there might be evidence to prove it, that this is the first one that was responded to that way in sales, but not in readership. I don't believe that reaction would have happened to Barchester Towers if it hadn't happened first to The Warden, in terms of affection. The Warden doesn't read like anything that Trollope had written before it. It has this kind of warm generosity, this kind of, the feeling that we've talked about, where you're settling into an armchair on a wonderful winter's night and you are being just surrounded by a wonderful storyteller. It's not necessarily telling a happy story, but the mechanism of it just feels so incredibly surrounding and inviting. That happens in The Warden. and it's on full display in Barchester Towers. But I think it probably got to readers with The Warden. I think readers probably read that, passed it all around, talked about it a lot, and realized if he can do this again, then I want it. I think that's probably true, and the reason that I think that there's probably facts to prove it is because if it weren't, I don't think Trollope would have returned to that story. I think he did because he had an intimation of how warmly the audience would receive it. But for him, in the middle of a chapter like that, to just talk about the mechanics of telling the story, it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. It irritates me a little because it's so sententious when he is guilty of it. In the book where he's lecturing, he's guilty of it. But I also think it's wonderful that he already knows at this point in the book that the reader is going to love Eleanor Bold, that they're not going to want these horrible people to capture her in a bad marriage, that sort of thing. It engages the reader in the act of reading instead of just in the story, and that is lovely. But anyway, sorry for the digression. That is this next chapter. We will move on to the next chapter next time, and I will see you then, hopefully with fewer interpolations. I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.